Okay, I hope that everybody can follow the lectures, and I hope that everybody can also follow the lectures on the YouTube channels that I'm recording. If you have any problem about that, please contact me, and so we'll try to see if if everything is going on appropriately. Please do not hesitate to contact me if you have any troubles in following the lectures. Today's lectures will be devoted on policy, essentially. Today we will discuss about the European policy concerning environmental impact assessment procedures and all the parallel procedures we shall discuss on. So today we'll discuss about European policy, and tomorrow, on Thursday, we'll discuss more in details about Italian's policy. Please, for the foreigner students, Erasmus students, please note that lecture on Thursday will be mainly in Italian because we will be discussing Italian policies. The idea of this lecture is that of providing the students an example of how European policies have been implemented into national legislation. The example I will provide, of course, concerning Italian legislation, so I will show you, I will give you a review of Italian laws that have been issued in order to implement the European policies. And the idea is that the Erasmus students shall use this information in order to look at their own national legislation to see how the European legislation have been implemented into their countries. So we shall start, as always, with a brief history of legislations. So as we already said, we start by the environmental impact assessment procedure as introduced by the NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act in 1969 in the United Nations, in the US. So the first implementation of environmental impact assessment legislation in the US goes back to 1969, in which there is the National Environmental Policy Act, implemented by the National Environmental Protection Agency, the United States, in which there was an imposition of obligation to submit environmental impact assessment procedures, EIA, concerning all decisions of the federal government that may have significant effects on the environment. Since 1969, NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, it was recognized that the inadequacy of simple cost-benefit analysis and environmental impact assessment. Yes?
I don't know, this file is in the Moodle or not. I cannot find the file, or it is the previous PDF.
No, I'm sorry. Yes, please forgive me. The problem is that I still do not have made available. Just give me one moment and I will make it available on the web.
Okay, gracias.
Thank you for making it clear to me. Sometimes I forget to do what I'm supposed to do. Okay, now you should find on the Moodle page the lecture of today. Please confirm me that you can see it.
Yes. Now it's true.
Okay, thank you very much for signaling.
Grazie, grazie.
Prego, prego. Okay, let's go back to the lecture now. Yes, we were discussing about the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, 1969. Before 1969, the only tool that was customarily employed in order to deal with environmental impact assessment was essentially cost-benefit analysis. But in the NEPA of 1969, it was recognized that cost-benefit analysis was not enough in order to reconcile the needs of environmental impact assessment procedures. So some more techniques were starting to be implemented. In Europe, we make a reference to the 1966 Étude d'impact environnemental that were issued in France for operations that can have disruptive effects on the environment. Then, as I already stated, we have to wait until 1985 by the European Commission to issue the key directive 1985-337, the so-called Environmental Impact Assessment Directive, in which it was stated that environmental impact assessment of certain projects, maybe public or private, should be carried. This is the framework law which organizes and gives a detailed disciplines that only binds the states to achieve results and leaves them the ability to choose how to implement this directive. And the deadline was 1988. As we will see, this directive will be implemented in Italy in 1986. But it is also important to refer to the Directive 11 of 1997, that is the second key directive of environmental impact assessment, in which the screening phase was introduced. So this it was formalized a way of evaluating which projects what maybe were listed in the annexes to the Directive of 85 may not undergo an environmental impact assessment procedure. So the idea is that in 1985, the European Community proposes a list of projects, and in 1997, they give kind of relaxing on the projects to be submitted for the environmental impact assessment procedure by giving some freedom to the member states to decide to implement which project shall really undergo an environmental impact assessment procedure. This is the screening phase. Then there is a third important directive that is in 2001, Directive number 42, but as I already introduced last week, introduced the strategic environmental appraisal, in which it is left to member states to decide in by planning phases which projects shall or shall not undergo environmental impact assessment. So the directives you shall refer, a European directive is the one of 1985, number 337, the one of 1997, number 11, and the one of 2001, number 42. So, as you may have noticed, we are not only talking about environmental impact assessment, so the directive of 1985, but we will also discuss several different flavors of these procedures. The very important one for environmental engineering is the IPPC directive, Integrated Pollution Prevention and Control, issued in 96, directive number 61, in which a special flavor of environmental impact assessment procedure, especially devoted to industrial plants, for industrial constructions. Then the strategic environmental appraisal of 2001, in which there is an indication or guidelines on which project in the planning phase should undergo an environmental impact assessment procedure. So strategic environmental appraisal, it is more a guideline concerning the implementation of plans. So I'm thinking here on to the plans for we call in Italian. In Italy, we call the plans for the implementation of public works. And then there is another part of these directives that has to do with incidence evaluation, directive number 43 of 92, that concerns the conservation of natural and semi-natural habitats in the flora and fauna, the so-called Habitat Directive, which extends more onto the protection of natural environment or semi-natural environment for against the impacts due to human construction and human impacts to natural systems. Environmental impact assessment is both an ancient and a modern tool. Is an old tool because was introduced as far as 1985 by this first directive, so more than 30 years today. But it is also modern because it was the precursor of impressive production of environmental legislation during the last 30 years. So the idea of the lecture of today is to give you a taste of the enormous amount of legislations that was produced as a consequence of European guidelines or European legislation into national member states legislations. Modern, because it is a global approach. Global meaning we try to include a global perspective. It has a prevention principle. So the idea is to implement protection action in a preventive way. And it anticipates in 1985 the IPPC Integrated Pollution Prevention and Control Directives that came out in 96, and the Strategic Environmental Appraisal, what in Italian we refer to as VAS, Valutazione Ambientale Strategica, that was issued by the directive of number 42 in 2001, and changes the time scale from short term to a long term strategic, as the word itself implies. Long term prevention protection idea. So what are the definitive characters of these environmental impacts assessment procedures? These procedures has a preventive character and integrates the tools of environmental auditing. Environmental auditing was the first way developed countries, modern countries, tried to implement protective actions, protective for the environment actions. So it is in environmental auditing were kind of voluntary tools, and as you may recognize by looking at the calendar, we will have a couple of seminars on these voluntary auditing tools. These voluntary auditing tools, environmental auditing tools, have been transformed into compulsory tools that are all fall under the wraparound concept of environmental impact assessment procedure. As told, environmental impact assessment uses a global approach, considers the following factors: atmosphere, aquatic environment, soil, subsoil, flora, fauna, ecosystem, public health, noise, vibration, and so on, cultural heritage, and their integration. So this is a very anthropogenic perspective, but there's an essay of trying to include a global approach in this anthropogenic perspective. Environmental impact assessment is an administrative procedure which represents the real conflicting interests concerning the public decision. So it is a procedure involving mass participation, the promoter, the designer, the drafter of environmental impact study document, administration, and the public as well. So if I will ask you what is environmental impact assessment, you shall answer environmental impact assessment is an administrative procedure in which there is an essay of trying to find a conciliation, compromise between the need of human development and the need of environmental protection. Environmental impact. Yes, please.
I have a question about the EIA global approach.
Yes.
Because you mentioned noise and vibration, but
Yes.
I also wonder about light pollution. Is that included, or is that talked about in general? Or
I say noise, vibration, and what is your question?
Light pollution. That a lot of animals and also people could be disturbed by a lot of lights, especially in cities, that it's never dark.
Yeah. You mean light, the disturbance coming from natural systems to human communities?
Yes, the fact that also humans, I think, but also animals are dependent on darkness to follow their
light. Sorry, yes.
Yes, light.
Yes,
light pollution.
Yes, light pollution.
Is this included in this global approach? Is it talked about? I wonder about
Yes,
that.
of course it is included, but as you will see from what I'm trying to explain in the next lecture, the problem is a very subjective one. So it depends on the particular environment you're studying and you're looking at. So in certain conditions, also light pollution may be an aspect that may be included into these global approaches. So light may also be an issue, of course. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. As I told you, environmental impact assessment is a technical scientific tool, but not only. During the cognitive phase is a technical elaboration with a prognostic view of a project data design. So it is an elaboration from a technical point of view. Prognosis means we are looking at scenarios, what will look the system, the ecological, the ecosystem after the implementation of human actions. But in the decision phase, the judgment retains, of course, some discretional traits that are confirmed by the planned participation of the public. So, of course, it is a matter of finding an acceptable compromise between the need, as I already told you, between the need of economic development, human society's economic development, and the protection of the environment. So, in the beginning, you will have a technical scientific approach in which there will be some tools, typically models, providing scenarios, so providing a possible evolution of the future, and by the provision of these scenarios, the policymakers should be helped in taking their decisions in order to minimize the impact on the environment of human activities. Let's give a look in detail on the meaning of the word. The terms environmental impact assessment, as I already told you, is a conceptual wrapper, but lends itself to retain, even under the same label, very heterogeneous tools. So we ask ourselves, what are we evaluating? What kind of nature is our evaluation? So what nature or what type, if you want, of evaluation, on what criteria is based evaluation, when it is the case to do this kind of evaluation, which authority is competent, and what are the aims and to which goals of these procedures. All these questions that I have summarized in order to try to give you an explaining of the concept of the idea of conceptual wrapper. So is the idea that under the term environmental impact assessment, very different and heterogeneous procedure may fall in. First of all, we shall focus on the term impact. Impact refers to what effects are part of the impact concept, on what factors. You may recall we have introduced environmental factors. So what factors should be considered in the impact evaluation, what size of the impact is really relevant. You may understand that all these questions may have very subjective answers. So we may not be able to find an universal answer to all these questions. Instead, the effort of environmental impact assessor is that of trying to find the most general way of implementing this procedure in order to include all the factors that the consultant feels relevant. So this has to do with a very specific problem we are looking at, in particular the environmental system you are focusing on, but also has to do with the very specific comprehension or understanding of the system by the experts that will participate to this effort. As I already anticipated, the environmental impact assessment procedure is carried on by a task of multidisciplinary scientists, very specific and expert in very specific subject. The effort is that of trying a way of putting together all these different pieces of knowledge with very different languages. When we think of the concept environmental, at least in my head, I think at natural environment, but also at anthropic environment, but also on socio-economic effects. All these perspective, natural, anthropic, socioeconomic, all fall onto the concept environment. So this is a very general approach. So what are the aims of this procedure? The environmental impact assessment procedure shall identify, describe, and evaluate the effects of a project on the various factors described. In particular, the environmental components, as we have already introduced, that is our way of describing the environment. The environmental impact assessment identifies and describes the current status. So we start by evaluating the status de facto. The environmental impact assessment procedure describes and assesses the project status. So what will happen during the implementation of the human project on the environment. So this is an assessment of a project status. The environmental impact assessment is based on a prognosis of possible perturbative effects of the initial environmental situation generated by the anthropic project. So again, I stress the fact that environmental impact assessors use models in order to provide prognosis or scenarios on how the future may look like if the human opera is implemented into the environment. Of course, environmental impact assessment has not a rigidly conservative function of avoiding any possible environmental changes. This means that we are realistic. We want to protect the environment, but also we want to allow economical development, or if you want, human societal development. The environmental impact assessment has a productivity perspective, but seeks to reduce potential damages caused by a project. So we want to be economically performant, we want to be productive, but we want to limit as much as possible the effects on the environment, of the natural environment. Losses that do not exceed the environmental quality standards are still acceptable. Please note, still acceptable. Notice losses that do not exceed the environmental quality standard. But what are the environmental quality standards? Good question. Environmental quality standards are, as I told you, anticipated, are subjective concept. So different experts may identify different environmental quality standards. The effort in the guidelines provided by the European legislation is that of trying to make these standards the most acceptable, the most accepted by all the member states of the community. The purpose of environmental impact assessment, so in the end, is that to reconcile the demands of economic and productive development with those of environmental heritage through a choice of compromise. And the compromise nowadays, you are ready to understand, may be called sustainability of the choices. So, which are the projects to be subject to the environmental impact assessment? It was an indication seen in the directive number 337, 1995, and also the directive number 11 of 1997. The directive concerns the environmental impact assessment of projects that can have an important environmental impact. So the integration of 97 comes to changing the concept of important to the concept of significant. Important was already quite vague. Significant is a little bit less vague, implying that it will be the expert, but experts of a multidisciplinary team that will draft out environmental impact study, that will select which impacts are to be considered significant. The types of projects to be submitted to environmental impact assessment procedure is contained in the annexes to the directive, in particular Annex 1 and Annex 2. And in these annexes, it is specified that the characteristics, the size and location of the planned works was defined in Annex 3, but shall give an indication of which are the projects that are expected to be submitted to environmental impact assessment procedure. Is this clear? Do you have any questions? Okay, let's go more in detail into the content of the directives, still 85 and 97. In particular, Article 3 defines the components of the impacts. Article 4 defines, and here I'm talking about the Directive 97 of 1997. Article 4 defines the project to be subject to environmental impact assessment. As I already told you, there is a list of mandatory projects, Annex 1, and a list left to the states discretionality that is in Annex 2. So this is, I recall you, the screening phase introduced by Directive number 11 of 1997. Then in Article 5, we have an indication of the context of environmental impact studies. Sorry, in Article 5 and more specifically, Annex 3 give you a list of the contents to be found in the environmental impact study. And Article 6, in particular, compels for participation, and in particular, as I already told you, participation of the public at large. Concerning national Italian regulation, Italian students know very well. Italy started the implementation processes of Environmental Impact Assessment Directive by Law 349/1986, so exactly the year after the European Directive, which addressed the issues in very general terms, leaving the definition of the details to subsequent legislation. In particular, this law is very important, especially for environmental engineers, because it is the law that introduces into the Italian political schema the Ministry of Environment. There was no Ministry of Environment before 1986. And as we will see, the Ministry of Environment is one of the main subjects involved in environmental impact assessment procedures. Now, I show you some slides that should be, act as a kind of notebooks for the Italian students, in which I list the very enormous amount of Italian legislation that followed by the implementation of the directives, of the European directives. As I told you, the first one is 1986 349, but it is the Ministry of Environment. Then we have an important one that introduces some technical norms, 1988, for the drafting of environmental impact studies and for the formalization of the judgment of environmental compatibility. You should become familiar with this terminology. The output of an environmental impact assessment procedure is a judgment of environmental compatibility. Judgment of environmental compatibility of what? Of the project to be implemented into that specific environment. When we have new norms issued in 1990, again, we have a law in 1994, law in 1996 that gives some address to the actualization of the requirements of the European directives. 1998, 1998, number 112. But where I want to come wait, is 1049. I'm looking for something that you know already, and it is so you see how many laws. But the key law is 152, issued in 2006. But it is the law, framework law for environmental issues. So it is the law that collects all the efforts, all the legislation in environmental issues, on environmental protection issues in Italy, and it is called the framework law for environmental protection, very well known by the Italian students, 152, law 152 and of 2006. But it is, let's say, the law which collects all these efforts, legislative efforts that were carried in the 90s. Nowadays, we have more implementation and updates to these laws, but the turning point is really the law number 152. But as I always tell to environmental engineering students, is the law that the Italian environmental engineer should know by heart, should keep on the side of his bed. So, all the reference for environmental impact assessment procedure may be found in these laws. So, some other legislative efforts besides 1986. So, the steps are 1986 Law 349, establishment of a Ministry of Environment, then some decrees 1988 with some specification of its implementation have been stated out. We have law decree of Presidents of Council of Ministers, so this is the Italian way, 27 December 1988, in which we have environment technical standards for the drawing up of environmental impact studies. So this is the reference law by which you should follow in order to draft an environmental impact studies. All have to do with the framework law on public works, the so-called Legge Merloni, that was issued in 1994, in which there was a first distinction between the preliminary schedule subject to environmental impact assessment as stated by Law 377 in 1988, and then the final level at which it should be made the environmental impact study. So the idea, according to the Merloni law, is that the environmental impact assessment procedure should be carried at the preliminary schedule that was subject to environmental pre-feasibility study, but as things goes in Italy, we have the so-called varianti in corso d'opera, so variation during the implementation, so that we had a decree of the President of the Republic, 99, number 554, implementing the regulation of Merloni's law, in which it was clarified that the environmental impact assessment procedure instead should be carried on the final and not on the preliminary or pre-feasibility phase of the study. So on the final approved project. What are the stages of environmental impact assessment procedure? Essentially, this procedure is divided in three phases: an introductory, an inquiry phases, and a decisory phases. Throughout the environmental impact assessment process, must be maintained a constant relationship between the information, a constant relationship of information between the authorities and the public who need to express opinions on various parts of the process and of the project. I recall you that one of the most innovative aspect of the directive of 1985, European Directive 1985, was that of the involvement of the public, and this is something very new concerning legislative procedures. So the European Community asked the member states, when implementing environmental impact assessment procedure, to consider also the opinion of the public. What are so the involved subjects? By a transversal readings of all these large amount of legislatory outcomes, so the three regulatory acts that are that of 1986 and the two implementing DPCM, so 1988, we sort out that the involved subjects are, first of all, the developer, that may be public or private, that starts the procedure. We have some nuances distinguishing between public or private. So, for example, in our regional legislation, we are distinction between the developer, but is a private, and the proposing authority that is a public subject. So also public authorities that propose works should undergo environmental impact assessment. And then the other subjects are the authorities that emanate with judgment concerning environmental compatibility of the project. So I recall you, as I told you, the outcome of an environmental impact assessment procedure is the issue of a judgment of environmental compatibility of a project. In general, it is the Ministry of Environment or the Ministry of Heritage of Culture or the Council of Ministers that all participate in the issuing of the judgment of environmental compatibility. Another important subject, it is the Environmental Impact Assessment Commission, that is a subcommission that it is defined by the Ministry of Environment. It is the Environmental Impact Assessment Commission that instructs the procedures, evaluates the programmatic framework, project and the project profiles, and the environmental effect. Also, the local government in our system in Italy, the regions, may be involved in the decision. The relevant regions shall be heard by the Environmental Ministry, the Ministry of Environment. Any citizens or any public subjects, because of participatory nature of the procedure, can produce instances, requests, comments, and opinions on the project as implemented. In order to try to put some order, all this mass of different subjects involving the decision, the Article 18 of Law 67, 1988 introduced the concept of Environmental Impact Assessment Commissions. Initially, this commission was seen as composed by 35 members, besides the president, that is usually the Ministry of Environment. These members are chosen among university professors, professionals, experts skilled in the design, environmental, economic, and legal disciplines, government and public administration and executives. For environmental impact assessment of infrastructure and settlements where it has been recognized in the agreement a shared regional interest, the board is also supplemented or integrated by member nominated by the regions or autonomous provinces that are concerned by the project. So essentially, the Environmental Impact Assessment Commission is the subject charged by the Ministry of Environment to follow all the procedure, and it is the counterpart with which the environmental engineer shall discuss in order to carry the environmental impact assessment procedure and to get a positive judgment of environmental compatibility for my project. Law 152/2006, so the framework law on environment, states that we shall have a single commission for environmental impact assessment, but also for strategic environmental appraisal and for integrated pollution prevention and control. The commission now is made up of 78 members, including the president, that I recall you is generally the Ministry of Environment, and 3 vice presidents chosen among university professors, professionals, qualified experts, and so on. And the commissions work in subcommittees, eventually supplemented by regional representatives. In particular, we will have a subcommittee that is charged to follow strategic environmental appraisal, such subcommittees that will be charged to follow IPPC procedures, strategic environmental appraisals as well. By the law decree of 2008 number 90, The commission has been reduced to 50 members, subdivided into 3 subcommissions, one for environmental impact assessment, in Italian via valutazione impatto ambientale, another one for special environmental impact assessment, what we call the grandi opere, ex legge Merloni, you may recall. Grandi opere meaning that some very relevant very large in terms of economic and terrestrial dimensions should be included, and then a commission that is for planning tools, that is strategic environmental appraisal via VAS in Italian. That is a subcommittee of the Environmental Impact Assessment Commission. Then, if we look at our very specific situation here in the Veneto region, we have a regional law number 10, 1999, that institutes the Regional Environmental Impact Assessment Commission, that is chaired by a regional secretary of environment. It is the equivalent, regional equivalent of the Ministry of Environment. The regional manager responsible for environmental impact assessment, the regional agency for the protection of the environment, ARPAV, director or a delegate, a director or delegate of the provincial department of the Regional Environmental Protection Agency, some provincial executive manager responsible for environmental protection, 9 experts, and so on. This is the Regional Environmental Impact Assessment Commission. Then the questions remains open: which are the subject, which are the projects that shall undergo regional or national environmental impact assessment. We will see some details on that when we will enter into the detail of Italian legislation next Thursday, so next lecture. So there will be some guidelines on which projects shall undergo national or regional environmental impact assessment procedures. I can anticipate that the regional environmental impact assessment procedures are reserved to projects that have only a regional relevance, so projects that will not impact on more than one region. If we have a project that will impact on more than one region, it is very likely that this project shall undergo to a national environmental impact assessment procedure. So as you will see, it is not defined a priori which project will undergo regional and which project will undergo to national environmental impact assessment procedure. Instead, it will be the proposer that, after consultation with the National Environmental Impact Assessment Commission, will decide if his project will undergo a regional or a national environmental impact assessment procedure. Okay, by now we shall stop here and we will go into the detail of a national legislation on Thursday. If you have any question, I will wait for your comments or questions here, or otherwise I will close the class in 10 minutes. And we will see on Thursday.